The Adventures of Dalton Matthews. Bigfoot Rules. There was a young boy named Dalton who lived on a farm with his family. On the farm there were many different animals. There were horses, chickens, pigs, goats, cows, and even ducks. With all of these animals came a lot of responsibility. Recently, Dalton had become old enough to help his father and his brothers with some of the chores on the farm. When Dalton turned 7, he was given chores to do every day after school before he could play. Dalton didn't like the fact that he had chores to do. He would much rather be playing in the cool treehouse that his father built for him in the yard. One day at school, Bobby Greer was playing tag with Dalton during recess. After school, Bobby invited Dalton over to his house so they could play in his new gaming system. This sounded very exciting to Dalton, and he really wanted to play video games, but he knew that he wouldn't be able to because of all the chores he had waiting for him at home. Dalton told Bobby about all the daily chores he was expected to perform at home, and Bobby snickered. Bobby told Dalton that his parents didn't make him do anything at home, and he had no chores, and he was able to play all the time. This got Dalton thinking. That afternoon, when Dalton got home, he looked out of his bedroom window at all the chickens in the coop, at the cows grazing the pasture and the pigs in their pen. He wondered who, if he didn't, would feed all of those animals and take care of them. Just then, he saw his father walking across the yard with a pail of water for the horses. Dalton figured it out. His father could do all the extra work, and Dalton wouldn't have to do any chores. He could be just like Bobby Greer. Just then, Dalton's mother called to him from downstairs. She was reminding him to do his chores. A mischievous smile slowly formed on Dalton's face. "I don't want to do my chores," Dalton bellowed from his room. In a flash, Dalton's mother was standing in front of Dalton, asking him why. "Bobby Greer doesn't have to do chores, and I don't want to either," said Dalton, looking straight into his mother's eyes. Dalton's mother was not pleased with that response. She went to get Dalton's father. Dalton turned to play with his cars, expecting his father shortly. Sure enough, moments later, Dalton's father entered the room. He sat down next to Dalton and said, "Son, why don't you want to do your chores?" "Bobby Greer doesn't have to, and I don't want to either. I just want to play." "But son," his father continued, "when you do your chores, you're helping out your whole family, not just me. We all have to help out so we can get the work on the farm done. Your mother helps with the cooking, cleaning, and care of you and your brothers. Your brothers help me with the animals and other duties, and I need you to help me also. It is only because we all work together doing our individual chores that we can function and survive together." "I'm not going to do any chores," Dalton pouted. "Well then," Dalton's father said calmly, "you will have to stay in your room as punishment until you're ready to help your family again." Dalton's father left the room and closed the door behind him. Dalton had done it. He had successfully evaded the chores that he disliked so much. That sure was easy, thought Dalton, as he smiled again. Next, he had to figure out how to get out of his room. In the meantime, Dalton started to play with his toys, occasionally stopping to watch his brothers and father scurry around the yard outside, doing his additional chores. By the evening, Dalton was getting bored of the toys in his room. He walked downstairs, but was stopped immediately by his mother, who asked him if he was ready to help. Dalton replied with an adamant "No." "Then march right back up to your room until you are," ordered his mother sternly. Dalton didn't like that. He had never been forced to stay in his room for such a long time before. He had to do something. He had to devise a plan of action. Dalton waited until all of his family was gathered at the dinner table. Then he grabbed his backpack and slipped out of the bedroom window. He walked quietly along the rooftop to the corner of the house, then lowered himself onto the rain gutter and slid down the drain pipe to the ground. He ran to the edge of the yard and then walked through the cornfield. All the while he looked ahead to the great oak tree that marked the beginning of the forest. That's where he was heading. It was beginning to get dark when Dalton reached the forest. He knew this forest well because he had made many trails on his dirt bike here. His footsteps were silent as he walked over the soft, mossy ground, being careful not to trip on exposed tree roots and fallen branches. Dalton could hear the calls of different birds and squirrels, all preparing for the night. He'd never been in the forest in the evening all alone before. The forest was very large, and soon he had lost his direction. He wasn't sure which way to go. As the darkness slowly crept in, Dalton knew he had to find a place to rest for the night, for he could hardly see now. He stopped to reach in his backpack to pull out a flashlight. That was better. Now he could see again. After a few more steps, Dalton discovered a large opening in the side of a huge tree, an opening that looked like he could fit in it. He looked inside the large hole with his flashlight, making sure there wasn't a bear or a monster sleeping in it. Then he climbed into it. It was perfect. He pulled a blanket from his backpack and covered himself. That wasn't so bad, he thought. And then he turned the flashlight off. Wow, was it dark. He couldn't see anything. There wasn't the slightest trace of light to be found anywhere. It was pitch black. Dalton was feeling afraid and lonely. Being in a different place, all by himself, he wished his father was there with him. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The loud, cheerful sounds of the birds singing merrily awoke Dalton, who popped out of his hiding spot to look around. Rays of sunlight peeked through the canopy of the treetops to shine deep into the forest, some even reaching the mossy ground. The dense forest concealed his surroundings, and everything seemed to blend into the greenery. A red cardinal landed in front of him. It turned its head, looked right at him, and then flew away. Dalton was feeling better now. He was not afraid anymore. He lay back in the tree thinking, where would he go? What would he do? He was getting hungry, so he reached into his trusty backpack and pulled out a candy bar. The calm tranquility of the forest was very relaxing, and it put Dalton at ease. Then he felt something. It was very small at first, but it was getting stronger and more intense. It was a vibration getting closer. Dalton stopped chewing and listened carefully. He peered out of his hiding spot and looked to the left. Nothing. He turned to the right. Then his eye caught a glimpse of movement. Popping out of the greenery, high above the ground, was a bright yellow school bus. What was a bus doing so high up in the forest, Dalton thought. It was crazy. The bus was getting closer to him, and so were the vibrations. Dalton collected his things, jumped out of his hiding place, and ran over to the side of a large tamarack tree so he could get a better look. It appeared as though the bus was coming down and stopping. Yes, it was stopping and the door was opening. Someone got on the bus, and then it continued. Dalton was very interested in this weird but amazing bus in the forest, and he stared right at it in disbelief. As the bus approached, getting closer, Dalton was startled by movement in the bushes behind him. He turned to see what it was. Then, without a warning, a weird creature appeared from the bushes right in front of him. It was a hairy creature, taller than he, and standing on 2 feet, 2 very large feet. "Hello," said the creature. Dalton stared in wild amazement. His mouth hung open in disbelief, for he didn't know what he was looking at. "What is your name?" asked the creature in a soft-spoken voice. The bus was right beside them now, and the door was opening. Inside, a larger version of the same type of creature awaited at the steering wheel. "Come on in, fellas," the driver said. The small creature walked past, grabbing Dalton's jacket, pulling him onto the bus with him. Dalton went along nervously. There were no other boys like him on the bus, only these hairy creatures with very big feet. Before he knew it, Dalton was pulled into an open seat next to the little creature. "So what is your name?" asked the little creature again as the bus started moving. The ride was very smooth as they climbed high up into the treetops. "Dalton is my name," he replied to the creature in a skeptical voice. None of the other creatures were looking at Dalton. He turned to look at the creature. "What are you?" Dalton asked inquisitively. "I am a Bigfoot," the creature responded. "We all live in this forest, and right now we are on our way to school." "Okay," said Dalton reluctantly. "What is your name?" "My name is Phineas," replied his new friend. The little creature had many questions for Dalton. He wondered where Dalton came from and where he was going. Dalton told Phineas that he had left home because he didn't want to do his chores. Changing the subject, Phineas explained that the school was high above in the top of a giant chestnut tree. Soon the bus started driving on an upward angle. Dalton looked out the window. They were driving beside a humongous tree limb that was leaning against an even bigger tree. Dalton simply stared in amazement. The other creatures were talking and paid no attention to him. It was weird. Phineas explained to Dalton that the tree with the large hole in it, where Dalton had rested for the night, that was actually a bus stop. The bus finally arrived at the front door of the school. Dalton and Phineas exited the bus and walked towards the main doors of the school, which was nestled in the center of the giant tree. The school reminded Dalton of his treehouse back home, only this one was much bigger. Phineas led him inside. There must have been 20 little Bigfoots already seated in the room, all with their noses buried in books. It felt weird for Dalton. The discipline exhibited by these little Bigfoots, no one was misbehaving, there was no shouting or running. Everyone there wanted to learn. There was a word printed boldly on the chalkboard for all to see. The word was cooperation. And that was the lesson of the day. The teacher started to explain what the word cooperation meant, and included examples. The teacher's example was of two people working together in cooperation to achieve a common goal. There was also a group example involving teams that worked together. On the teams, every single player had a position or duty that contributed to the entire team's success. The teacher asked a few Bigfoots in the front if they understood what this all meant, and then he asked Phineas. "Yes, I understand what cooperation is," said Phineas. "When my father splits and cuts the firewood, I stack it in a pile beside the house. We work in cooperation to get the job done," continued Phineas. Dalton thought about the work he used to do around the farm, and realized that his family was like a team, and that they all worked in cooperation. After school, Phineas invited Dalton over to his house to play. Since Dalton didn't have to go home to do chores, he responded with a yes. On the way home to Phineas's house, they talked about family activities. Dalton wasn't sure exactly what these activities were, but they sounded like fun. When they got off the bus, Phineas asked Dalton if he wanted to play a game. Dalton nodded in agreement. "What game shall we play?" asked Dalton curiously. "This game is called Pick Up Sticks," replied Phineas with a smile. After the rules were explained, Dalton was anxious to start. Phineas yelled, "1, 2, 3, go!" Dalton visibly scoured the ground, looking for branches and twigs as he walked quickly. He could see from the corner of his eye that Phineas was doing the exact same thing. By the time that they both reached the tree where Phineas lived, their arms were bulging with twigs and branches and sticks of all sizes. Dalton dropped his load near the base of the trunk of a massive tree, and Phineas did the same. Just then Phineas's mother appeared and congratulated both of them on all the branches they had collected. She pulled out 2 lollipops and handed one to each of them. Dalton didn't realize it, but that was a reward. "Want to go skip rocks?" asked Phineas. Dalton nodded. Phineas grabbed 2 pails and handed one to Dalton as he kept walking towards a path that led to the lake. The end of the path opened up to a small, calm lake with a rocky shoreline that was surrounded by trees. They both dropped their pails and scoured the ground for skipping rocks. Each of them kept throwing rocks to see who could skip it the furthest. Dalton was able to skip one rock 5 times. "The winner!" "You won, Dalton," said Phineas. "Now let's get back before dinner. Mom needs this water," said Phineas as he dunked the pail in the lake, filling it completely. Dalton filled his pail with the same method. "That was fun," Dalton remarked as they walked homeward. When they finally arrived at Phineas's home, they set the heavy pails down in front of the steps. "Do you want to see my room now?" asked Phineas. "Sure," said Dalton. Phineas led Dalton through a secret door hidden in the base of the tree trunk. Inside was a spiral staircase leading up. "Wow!" exclaimed Dalton as he started climbing the stairs. "This is cool!" At the top, there was a trap door that opened above their heads. Phineas pushed it up and open, revealing a large, spacious room. There were many windows all around, several logs and chairs to sit on, but no TV or electronics. What are we going to play with?" thought Dalton, a little bit worried. Phineas walked to the edge of the room and opened his wooden chest with homemade wooden cars and trucks painted many different colors. Dalton immediately thought of all the cool toys he had piled in his room back home. Phineas started to remove the toys from the chest. The two of them constructed imaginary roadways and trails that took them far into the forest and worlds of their imaginations. It was strange. Dalton didn't think that such simple toys made by Phineas's father could be so much fun to play with. Dalton paired his 2 favorite trucks next to each other. He noticed the great detail involved in their construction. All of a sudden, they began to move. All on their own, the 2 trucks started rolling forward, and then BAM! The trapdoor flung open and the 2 trucks went flying. Phineas's father crept up into the room carrying a goose over his shoulder. "Here's dinner," he said. Next, Phineas's brother followed with an armful of fresh vegetables. Dalton sat back and observed how all the family members came together, in cooperation, to produce a wonderful meal. Dalton was hungry and anxious to eat. The family sat down at the table together. Phineas's father gave thanks before they were all able to partake in the aromatic entree. It was a feast fit for a king. There were candied yams that tasted incredible, and a wild spinach and blueberry salad with a honeydew dressing. The main course was a large goose, slow roasted over a fire, drizzled with maple syrup. Everyone gorged themselves on this fantastic meal. Dalton leaned back in his chair. His belly now full from dinner, he listened to the calm crackling of the fire. Witnessing the close interaction of this family, Dalton started thinking about his own family. He realized now that his family also worked together. They just had different tasks because they lived on a farm. Dalton thought about all the toys and luxuries he had back in his room. He missed his family very much and wanted to go back home. After thanking Phineas and his family for being so kind to him, he excused himself from the table, grabbed his backpack, and left the treehouse headed for home. It was dusk now, and Dalton couldn't wait to get home to see his family. It felt like he had been away for a whole week. He looked for landmarks to guide him in the right direction, but his view was obstructed by all of the trees. He thought he knew which way to go down the trail, but everything looked the same. In every direction, all he saw was trees. He stopped for a minute. As he was collecting his thoughts, he heard something approaching him from behind. When he turned to look, the noise stopped. He was becoming a little uneasy with the situation, so he started to walk a little faster. The noise came back. It was the sound of something big, following him just inside the tree line where he couldn't see it, but he definitely heard branches breaking under the weight of something large. Dalton walked even faster, trying not to look behind him for fear of a monster, a great big bear. The noise seemed to get even closer. The last of the light was slowly fading with the sunset, so Dalton knew he had to make a break for it and run. With all of his energy, Dalton sprinted across the floor, dodging exposed roots and other obstacles. It was getting hard to see the trail, but he couldn't slow down. Dalton heard a loud growl right behind him, and he could feel the vibration of very heavy feet stomping the ground. Something was about to get him. The hair on the back of Dalton's neck stood up. Dalton turned to peek while he was running so fast, and then wham! Straight to the ground Dalton fell. He lay on his back, shivering in fear, for he could hear several large beasts closing in around him. The snarling and growling was right upon him. A large dark object was getting closer, looming over him, closer and closer. Then everything went black and silent. Dalton felt his body being shoved and pushed in every direction. Then he heard his name being called loudly. He was afraid to open his eyes, but he did. Everything appeared a little blurry and bright at first, but then he recognized some voices. One was his older brother Chris, and the other his younger brother Aaron. "Dinner's ready," they chimed in unison. Dalton got up off the floor and walked towards the door. Then he abruptly stopped and turned to look out of his bedroom window. He pulled back the curtains and looked towards the forest, by the great oak tree that guided his adventure. Phineas was somewhere out there, he thought. As Dalton walked down the stairs, he felt something in his pocket. He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a flat, smooth stone. Was this one of the stones he had selected while skipping rocks with Phineas?